Under Standing Orders 8.13, I'm required to organise at least one joint meeting between candidates and members at the earliest opportunity after the close of nominations to ensure that all candidates are known to the House ahead of the election. Members of the Legislative Council have also been invited to observe these proceedings, as have the media. I'll start by giving each candidate 3 minutes to make an opening statement and will allow a similar 3 minutes for closing statements when it appears to me that adequate opportunity has been given to ask questions. I'd ask each candidate to keep their answers brief to allow as many questions as possible, but I will limit answers to 3 minutes to ensure this. Members are of course free to meet the candidates outside of the hustings, and candidates have already taken the opportunity to write to members, which is of course perfectly acceptable. Once the candidates have given their opening statements, I would appreciate it if honourable members could signify their wish to ask a question by raising their hands, and I will call on them in the order that they catch my eye. 3 candidates are Paul Beckett, Jane Poole-Wilson and Alan Wright, and as he sat nearest to me, I'll ask Paul Beckett if you'd like to go first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to start off with, I've had some feedback from members who wonder whether, because I'm a practising advocate, that the role in Leg Co would be a kind of top-up or a side issue. No. I've reached that age where if I want to continue to practice law, I can do when the opportunity affords itself. So the role in Leg Co would be my job, day job, evening job, weekend job, and every other form of job. The second point, I only want to make 2 points, and the second point is, why do I want to do it? The answer is the answer that you already have as why you wanted to become members of the House of Keys. What you were thinking when you put yourself forward for the House of Keys, each of you, something slightly different. All of those things are in my head at the moment. So I'm in the same space, the same place that you were when you first decided to stand for public office. Perhaps a 2.5 point. I've got a lot of local Manx legal experience and wider experience. I don't just sit in an ivory tower as a lawyer, but do other things. And I can hit the ground running. I don't regard lawyers as having any higher status than anyone else. We're not no more special than anyone else, except possibly in the Bart Simpson sense from time to time. And all I can offer is 30 years of experience and the thought that's in your head as to why you wanted to become public officials and members of the government in the first place. Thank you.
Jane.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker and honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. I was born and brought up here. I had a great education at Ballacomine High School, and more broadly I benefited from the quality of life we have and the richness of opportunity available here. I feel very strongly about the future success of the Isle of Man in terms of attracting people to live here and work here, and in terms of good quality of life and prosperity being shared across our society as a whole. I believe that good, effective government is vital to achieve this. The Legislative Council's role as a revising chamber and providing scrutiny, I think, is important. Scrutiny, as Lord Lisbane put it, is parliamentary motherhood and apple pie. In essence, good scrutiny means good government. I did consider standing for the Keys last year, but having just stepped back from a role that involved a large amount of off-island travel to focus more time on my family, the timing just wasn't right. When Mrs. Caine approached me about this vacancy, I looked at the role and considered that I had highly relevant skills and experience, and also the willingness to put in the hard work and commitment to try and make a success of the role. My suitability is not only based on my background as a lawyer, but on my broader experience in private, public, and more recently, voluntary governance roles. As you would expect, my legal experience means I am practised in understanding and analysing information with an eye for detail and questioning and probing, which I think are skills important for a scrutiny role. We none of us are experts in everything, and I think it's important that we're all able to try and master new areas, and also, though, to collaborate with others, to try and understand their perspective, and then to use that in order to try and seek effective outcomes. I'm very experienced in tackling new challenges and new areas, As Deputy Legal Aid Certifying Officer on the Isle of Man, I had to come up to speed with the Manx legal aid system, not ever having practiced legal aid myself. When I was at UBS, I was responsible for all employment matters across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, dealing with multiple legal frameworks and cultural systems that were outside my immediate experience. And since the financial crisis of 2008, I've worked with a large number of financial organisations globally, collaborating with a range of specialists in order to try and drive improvements in areas like regulation, scrutiny and promoting more ethical business practices. My most recent role as trustee of St Christopher's, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to meet some of our young people in care, as well as the staff, and hear the issues and then try and deal with those at council level. In all of my roles, it has been important to understand the detail
I'm afraid
of
that's your
different
3
issues.
minutes. I'm terribly sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
Alan, I can call you to...
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Honourable members, I'm standing for election to the Legislative Council as I believe I can continue to make a difference to our society on the island. For my early years in employment, I've served the community in the police service, acting with integrity, professionalism and transparency. Changing my career after 25 years, I started up and ran a small business for a number of years and then went back in 2011 back into the civil service, where I worked in both the General Registry and the Department of Economic Development, up until the 3rd of May this year. These careers have given me knowledge, ability and experience that I can bring to the Legislative Council and to Tynwald as a whole. I've served on committees in the police service, leading to change in the environmental strategy and other matters in the late 90s. I've served more recently on committees changing departmental structure in both my former departments, bringing value and financial savings to government. Through my past work as chair and committee member for Peel Football Club, I've helped guide the club through a period of transition, leading it forward to where it is today. As a member of the Executive Committee for Prospect, I was involved during negotiations affecting the pay and working conditions for members of the civil service regarding the Government Unified Pension Scheme and new terms for new starters. I'm used to working to tight deadlines. I gained this and other project management skills from my studies with the Open University, which was carried out whilst bringing up my children and working in the constabulary. There was a lot of time management involved, but in the end persistence paid off and I received my degree. On a personal note, I think I have a good sense of humour. I have a decent amount of common sense. I don't rush to judgment, preferring to gather the available evidence and then come to a sound, informed decision. I'm willing to look at the situation from both sides of the argument. I have been involved in a lot of change management and was recently involved in the start of a large IT project which will modernise the land and deeds registry systems, bringing them into line with the government's digital strategy. I have over the last 40 years been used to dealing with both primary and secondary legislation involving environmental, criminal and employment law through using it both on a daily basis and reviewing it at various stages of my career. The experience I have gained through over 30 years of public service and elsewhere has given me valuable insights into how the government of the day operates and how the policies affect the whole of our society. Today we see major challenges ahead for this government in good fiscal management across all departments. Brexit, which I will have no doubt have a major impact not only on government but also on all parts of our society. Muddyval and our island image on the global stage, the SAVE programme which aims to find £25 million in savings over the next 5 years, and of course the Chief Minister's programme for government. I have spoken to members of the Legislative Council. I am fully aware that this is in no way a part-time job.
Sorry, time's up. Right, I now need to throw the floor for questions. First, Mr. Robertshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I possibly ask each of the candidates whether, in consideration of their role, possible role in LegCo, whether they think it is right or wrong for members of LegCo to act as members of departments with delegated powers?
So, we'll say it again and start with Mr. Beckett.
I wouldn't be a part-timer, but I wouldn't serve in a government department. I'd give my whole time to LegCo. I would spend as much time on the scrutiny committees as was required of me. And on top of that, perhaps something new. And I said it when I wrote to you all. I'd make myself available on a one-to-one basis, unlimited amount of time, to talk about any aspect of legislation, any help I could possibly give all members of Tynwald. This isn't a lib van thing. But I hope you won't think me lazy or ducking responsibility. But I do think that the potential conflicts of interest when a member of LegCo is a member of a government department, and the lack of political justification, policy justification in LegCo, means I wouldn't be in the department. But I'd be doing everything possible for Tynwald in every other respect.
I too regard member of the Legislative Council as a full-time role. I do think Liz Vannin is broadly right to say that members of the Legislative Council, particularly if not directly elected, should not be in government. I have heard by talking to some members some of the practical issues of how well do members of the Legislative Council then understand the day-to-day workings of government. I feel there must be a way of allowing members of LegCo to understand the challenges and the issues in departments without necessarily becoming departmental members. I feel the scrutiny role is possibly one that needs more emphasis through Legislative Council, and that in order to do that well and to give full attention to that, it probably does risk a conflict situation if you were also sitting as a departmental member. So my instinct is, and I would be prepared to hear arguments as to why this might not be possible day one, but my instinct is we should certainly be working towards a situation where LegCo members are not political members.
Is that a yes or a no?
That's a, what, would you serve? No.
I serve Red Law Liz Vann's report. I wouldn't serve as a departmental member.
You would?
I wouldn't.
Next question is in the hands of Mr. Ashford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It follows on very nicely from the previous question. One of the major topics that will be coming forward to Tynwald shortly is the Liz Vann report. What aspects of the report do you agree with, and what aspects don't you agree with? And in particular with reference to what has been long publicly debated now about whether Legislative Council should be publicly elected or still appointed as it is now. What's your views on that?
I think focusing on the last part of your question, no, LegCo should not be publicly elected. LegCo is there to serve the House of Keys. If we are to bring democracy into LegCo, then we can go for the nomination committee system that has already been proposed and will probably be introduced, to get as wide a range of people as possible, and not just those of us in this inner circle, to be able to come forward for it. In terms of the ability to choose who's in LegCo, that should be in your hands. Who can you work with? LegCo is there to assist you. Yes, it has an independent vote. It's there to assist you. You've got to have people with whom you feel comfortable and who are going to contribute to your work and make the process of legislation easier. As far as the rest of Liz Vann is concerned, it seems to be extremely sensible. It's very broad. The legislation, how much have I got? Oh, thank you. The legislation section, I think, needs a little more thought. I'm not entirely convinced, for example, saying perhaps a little controversially, that the bishop ought necessarily to have a role in LegCo, or if the bishop does, then the bishop should be the representative of all faith groups in the Isle of Man. And I think we probably have a new bishop who would be more than happy to fill that role. So apart from that, it's a damn good blueprint for the way forward.
I have read Lord Liz Vann's report. I broadly agree with his recommendations for reform. I also think there would be difficulties. I think the difficulties he highlights in directly electing members of the Legislative Council, I think are probably quite difficult to overcome in practice. The issue of conflict possibly arising between the House of Keys and members of the Legislative Council, I think is a real issue, and I'm not sure that there's an obvious way around that. Having said that, I can see that one of the problems we have had historically is a sense of democratic deficiency, and also a sense that, well, how are these people getting into the Legislative Council and what exactly are they doing for the public good? So I think this process that we have today and future reform that shows more clearly who are the candidates, why are they suitable, what skills and experience do they bring, and what role are they actually fulfilling. So I think we need to do more to show the role of revising legislation, but critically the scrutiny role. I think we do need to be more transparent with the public to show exactly what benefit that brings to our democratic institutions. So I wouldn't be in favour of direct election as things stand, but I am in favour of processes and increased transparency to show who is being appointed and why. I think I would agree with the point on the bishop, actually. If there is, I am not strong either way about whether the bishop should have a seat on the Legislative Council. I don't think the bishop should have a vote on the Legislative Council if it is deemed appropriate still for the bishop to remain. There's nothing else that immediately springs to mind. Oh, the nomination. Have I got time?
Yes, a minute and a quarter.
I think the process for appointing members of the Legislative Council, I think it is right that the House of Keys selects or votes on who should become a member. As to whether we need a nominations commission, I am attracted to a route that draws in people with relevant experience and skills, that tries to drive a diversification, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a woman. I think as a revising chamber and a scrutiny chamber, we need it to be representative of our island and our island's population. So I don't know that the nominations commission is the perfect route or the only route, but I do think we need to make sure that we are attracting people in with a range of skills and expertise that will help the functions of the Legislative Council.
I don't think that Legco should be directly elected. I think it should come from yourselves, the Keys, or through a nomination council. As the other two candidates were already brought up, if we have a directly elected by the populace, we then have perhaps conflict between your Keys member and your Legco member. Personally, I think we should stay with either nominations or from yourself, as we have done this one.
Next question is in the hands of Dr. Allinson.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask each of the candidates what they think is the greatest challenge to this administration.
Now, on this one, we'll start with Mr. Poole-Wilson, if that's all right. Mm-hmm. So, greatest challenge to this administration?
Well, it would be tempting to talk a lot about Brexit at this point. Having read the Cabinet Office's fourth interim report, I have a good sense that there's a lot of work being done in the civil service to get a grip on all the potential changes that will flow. So if we park Brexit for a moment, because clearly that is a huge issue, I think the real challenge is walking the quite tight line between boosting the economy and trying to make sure that the economy grows in a way that brings in skilled workers and means that we share prosperity, with also keeping our public services of as high a quality as possible and balancing, trying to balance the government's books. And I think the programme for government is a really strong step in terms of trying to show the key steps that the government is trying to prioritise to achieve that. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think, how do you judge I think the fact that we cannot go on probably providing full-scale public services in the way that perhaps people have been used to is a real issue, and making decisions about where you might sort of have to provide them through another means, I think these are the real challenges. But I think if we want to be successful, it is not enough to grow the economy. I think you need the dual pull of a strong economy with interesting and skilled jobs and good quality of life. If you ask why people come and live here and want to make it their home, it is that quality of life and that availability of good education, good health services, good infrastructure that will make a real difference, as well as the interesting jobs.
Mr. Wright.
The greatest challenge that the government faces today, I think there's a number of them. Obviously, good fiscal management. We have an ageing population. We have, as you probably well know, for some reason, not many babies are being born, and if we don't have children, pardon the expression, put it cheaply, we won't have the future. So without young adults, young parents coming to the Isle of Man, kids being born, we won't have money coming in. There won't be a money stream. I'll put it as crudely as that. So basically, we need to make the island as attractive as possible to people to come here to work, good working environment, good social care, good tax system, open, honest and transparent government.
Mr. Beckett.
I think we focus, all three of us, it's the economy. The biggest challenge I think this administration has got is managing an economy which is, the way the world has gone and is going, somewhat fragile. We have a finance sector which may or may not grow. We have a corporate service provider sector which isn't growing. We have an e-gaming sector which is very welcome and making a contribution, but could equally go. What I think we need to do is what we've already started to do. The programmes through the Department of Economic Development, for example, the Enterprise Development Scheme, the loans, the Manx Biomed sector. The government over the next 5 years has got to look at those specific niche industries and niche interests that the Isle of Man can particularly foster. Intellectual property management here, for example. There are things that don't take factories and warehouses that we can do absolutely superbly and maintain our way of life. So if we were to say, if I was to sum it up in one sentence, the biggest challenge is simply the economy.
Thank you. The next question is in the hands of Mr. Hooper.
If you are successful enough to be elected now, can you outline one thing that you would get at the end of your 9-month term, one thing you'd be very happy to have achieved, one thing you'd be proud to say, actually I did this in 9 months?
So I'll start again with Mr. Poole-Wilson.
Well, I would hope that we would have dealt with the recommendations by Lord Lisvane. And you asked for one thing, so I shouldn't list more than one thing. All right, I'd like to park that for a minute. The Equality Bill, I think, is a very big piece of legislation which is coming into force this year. And there will be a large number of secondary pieces of legislation. I think it's very important that the Legislative Council has good, strong input to getting that right, because it impacts not only people's lives day to day, but it makes a difference to employers moving here, that they understand what's happening and that we've managed to bring that in smoothly and get it correct.
Mr. Wright.
The one thing at the end of 9 months, I'd like to look back and think that I've worked cooperatively with the Keys to achieve what you, after all, are the policy setters and the lawmakers had set out to do in the 9 months that I'd be available in the council.
Mr. Beckett.
I'd say the same as Alan. If the end of term report in February next year said, turned up, did the job, knew what he was doing, was available for all, then I think that's the one thing, doing the job, that I would be proud of having achieved.
Thank you very much. The next question is in the hands of Mr. Thomas. Please speak up to the sound systems at the front.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the three candidates here. Each of you, to varying degrees, criticised the process of scrutiny of policy and legislation in the past. So I'm looking for an example of where we should have done something slightly better in the last couple of years. And secondly, Lord Lisvane had quite specific recommendations about how the Tynwald committees should treat the programme for government, and I wondered what each of the members thought about how parliamentary bodies should treat the government's programme for government.
Chris never asked one question.
Yeah.
That Chris.
On the basis of giving everybody 2 chances each to go first, I'm going to call on Mr. Wright to go first for this one.
Can you repeat the question?
Don't encourage him. You want to perhaps pick the most important of the 2 questions that you asked, Mr. Thomas?
My one question in 2 parts is as follows. The first part is each of you has criticised scrutiny in the last couple of years to an extent. Give me an example. Second part, we have a programme for government. What would your role be as an MLC helping Tynwald committees review or scrutinise the programme for government?
Mr. Wright.
I haven't actually criticised government policies in the past. If you recall, what I said was I saw what the impact of government policies were on our society. I didn't actually say I criticised them. There might have been some that I personally didn't agree with, but you as members of the Keys, you get the feedback from the populace as to where people are going wrong or where they think you're going wrong. Bear in mind the fact that sometimes you as the Keys have to give the population a nasty medicine, whether they like it or not. So I wouldn't say that I've actually criticised any policies in the past.
Mr. Beckett.
Well, I use an example, the Equality Bill, the Equality Act. As a human rights lawyer, one of the things I do, human rights, I'm obviously not against it. It's massively too long, it's cut and pasted from England. Our legislative draftsman wasn't given the ability to do what he could do. It could have been far shorter. Far, far shorter. I think I said when I spoke at statutory interpretation talk, it's long, it's wrong. So, scrutiny. That would have gone to a Tynwald committee. The Tynwald committee could have been given a much broader idea of alternative ways of achieving exactly the same thing for a jurisdiction in which human rights abuses are very, very few and far between, and you don't need a permanent, vast structure to deal with the one or two occasions when it comes up. So, Chris, there's your working example. The Equality Bill could have been much simpler. It would have become simpler through greater scrutiny, perhaps in the policy committee. I wasn't there, I don't know what went on. So just that.
Okay. Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
I think my perception is that we are not aware of the scrutiny, and that what you hear are comments that pieces of legislation are not fit for purpose, or that something has been missed out. Actually, I would probably not choose the Equality Bill as an example, and that's only because when you read it alongside the UK Equality Act, and I recognise that large chunks of it have been lifted, I'm not quite sure how you would achieve the levels of protection. If the idea was to achieve a parity with the UK levels of protection, how you would do that by cutting it out. So I think my sense is that I hear that things go through and that there are gaps, or that things, when they're implemented, are not achieving the defined purpose. And I think that's where, in order to try and avoid that, for example, with the Programme for Government, if you're going to amend the Education Act, which obviously is a piece of legislation in the pipeline, I would be very keen to know that the consultation with head teachers, with all interested parties who are going to be affected by that legislation, is coming in at a very early stage, and that we are talking to the people who have a real understanding of the impact of changes to make sure we get it right the first time. I think it is very important. My own working career, they brought in working time laws in the UK. There has been a massive problem because it introduced a statutory right to holiday pay without thinking about, well, what happens if somebody's off on long-term sick and they still request holiday. And we've had multiple cases in the UK to try and get to the bottom of that. So for me, the importance of scrutiny is making sure that we are getting the people who have practical know-how and expertise in at an early stage to understand the real impact, and then picking that up properly as early as we can in the legislative process.
Thank you. Next questions, I've got Mr. Robertshaw, Mr. Cregeen, and then Mr. Shimmins. Mr. Robertshaw.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The candidates have all indicated that they have considered the Lisvane report. Personally, I'm still wrestling with the proposal on page 55, which talks about the need for a bill committee for each and every bill. Have you, as candidates, considered that issue at all in your deliberations of Lisvane? Anybody really?
So, again, I'll start with Mr. Wright.
No, I haven't considered it. I think it should be considered by legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Beckett.
That level of detail I haven't drilled down into. I think Lisvane said that he wanted to review the process of primary and secondary legislation, just as a kind of butterfly thought sideways from that. A lot of our legislation is secondary legislation, which is either laid on the table and often not scrutinised at all. More and more we have short acts and masses of statutory documents and general circulars, government circulars. I think there you should be focusing. There the devil is in the detail. Is your will being inadvertently defeated or suborned by secondary legislation that hasn't been looked at all? Can't be, because of the volume. That would be my thought.
Thank you.
I haven't drilled down into that level of detail. I'm mindful that scrutiny and good legislation also cannot overly absorb the energies of our Legislative Council and government. So my instinct would be that do we necessarily need a committee per bill?
That was
I'm not sure, because it will depend on the bill. I think if you have a far-reaching piece of legislation like the Equality Bill that cuts across all manner, it's services as well as employment, when you have something with that level of impact, I think you then do, it's worth investing the time and energy and resource to get that right. A smaller bill, no. I think there are other ways of getting the input and getting it right.
Next question, Mr. Cregeen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As all candidates have said that they're going to make this a full-time post, can they confirm that they will not be taking up any outside paid employment? And subsequently, you were saying about scrutiny committees, you're assuming that Liz Vane is going to be adopted. If it is not adopted regarding the scrutiny committees, as the scrutiny committees are currently filled, how do you think you will fill your time if it is not adopted that way? Because you will not be in a department, you'll not be in a scrutiny committee, so how do you think you'll fill that full-time position?
Okay, start this one with Mr. Beckett, please.
The only outside paid employment, were you in the room when we started? I gave you 3 minutes. Well, I covered this earlier. Full-time, LegCo, full-time job, daytime, nighttime, weekend time and everything else. I've reached the point in my, just repeating what I said earlier, I've reached the point in my career where I can perform legal consultancy or not. It's not something that I have to do all the time. So when you say paid outside work, makes you sound like 9 to 5, and this is the add-on. No, absolutely not. There may be occasionally some legal consultancy work outside. I wouldn't want to abandon my human rights clients. That's actually not paid. I don't take any money for that. If I were not, why wouldn't I be on the scrutiny committee? But if I weren't, assuming I weren't, then I mentioned earlier, I would be working one-to-one with the MHKs. That's something quite new. I'm just going to make myself available to talk to the MHKs outside LegCo just as a person. And the third thing I would do, if you really envisage that LegCo doesn't have enough work for us to do within LegCo itself, something I wrote to you all about, I would be working with the charitable institutions that I've worked with on the island, starting with Manx Blind Welfare, the Manx Deaf Society, I've worked with for many, many years, because let's face it, MLC after your name, you can do a damn sight more for fundraising and getting the charities strengthened than you could as a private citizen. But I really don't think we would not be on scrutiny committees.
But I'm sorry, if it make it clear, as the scrutiny committees are currently filled at the moment, if Liz Vane is not adopted, you would have to be waiting for vacancies for them to be filled.
I do appreciate that, yes.
I have been having a career break doing small pieces of paid consultancy work in my particular field, which is employment law and HR. Provided it was, I do regard it as a full-time role, provided it was compatible and led to no conflict of interest, and I was asked to do a discrete small piece of work, I would like to be free to do that, but not at the expense of detracting from the primary responsibility as a member of the Legislative Council, and certainly not in a way that created any conflict of interest whatsoever. I would also like to continue my volunteer positions as a trustee of St Christopher's and also a parent governor around school, but I regard those as compatible. I mean, I've always worked full-time, and that's more time than there is in a standard working week, so I would make it work so that it didn't detract from responsibilities in the Legislative Council. I also think it would be of benefit to LegCo to have those continued interests. I'm a bit like Paul in that I would hope that whoever is on the Legislative Council and whatever the output of our debate on Lord Lisvane, the debate in due course, there would be active roles where members of the Legislative Council can really make a contribution, whether that's dealing with legislation day to day in the Council or supporting scrutiny committees or supporting political members. I don't feel we should be in departments if we're members of the Legislative Council. I don't think that then stops you, though, providing input and advice if that is sought from political members.
Mr. Wright.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cregeen. I resigned from the civil service on the 3rd of this month to stand as a member for Ledgecombe. This would be the full-time job. I have no other outside interests. I do obviously know people. I know a few societies around Peel, the football club and stuff like that. But no, this would be the full-time job.
Thank you. Next question is in the hands of Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask all the candidates, there are currently 2 political parties in Tynwald. Do you see political parties as the best way to govern the Isle of Man?
Now, first one this time will be Ms. Poole-Wilson.
I am not against political parties at all. I think it can work very well. I think the challenge for us is, as we're so small, how well we can make it work for us. I think the other thing, actually, that is a downside of a political party system is that, unfortunately, then what will tend to happen, and we can see it now in the debates that are going on in connection with the general election campaign in England, is that we tend to get sometimes quite blunt levels of debate. There isn't as much room for people to be persuaded, to hear the other side of the argument, perhaps to change their view based on the evidence. And I think what we do have through our coalition of independents broadly in the Isle of Man is a real opportunity to, you will have your view, but then through debate and discussion, and particularly based on evidence, to be able to take that into account and to change your mind if you think that is the appropriate thing to do, without that compulsion to toe the party line. So I think for our size, I think our current system, it probably works on balance pretty well for us.
Okay. Mr. Wright?
I think our system works very well at the moment. We are a small island, a society of about 80,000 people. As Jane has already mentioned, we've seen across the water, if you have a party majority, are you going to vote with the party majority, or are you going to vote with, as it were, the party manifesto, or are you going to vote what's best for the country? So, no, I'm not in favour of party politics on the Isle of Man. I think also it gives you, the members, the freedom to then vote with your conscience, as well as voting for your electorate as well.
Okay. Mr. Beckett?
It's evolving, isn't it? The party system in the Isle of Man, just as it did in other jurisdictions over many, many centuries. I'm a member of Liberal Vannin. We have certain core policies, but they're very few. How does a party come together? People with similar interests and similar outlook find they can work together very well. The periphery of policies, the penumbra of policies, is entirely conscience-driven and is not laid down in stone. So you've got the ability to preserve that independence of thought on many, many, many issues. And you would vote in the same way anyway on the core issues. It just happens that you've got a group of friends who have the same opinion as yourself. Set that now in a new context. Everything has changed. There is now a programme for government. So the Liberal Vannin Party has contributed to the programme for government, and all of you have agreed to the programme for government. So wrapped around individual groups with particular points of view, you have a totality and a consistency. That, I think, is what has changed, a completely new dawn for the Keys and for Tynwald.
Thank you. The next question is Mr. Hooper.
This sort of follows on from what Graham was asking before, actually. There's been a lot of talk amongst all three of you about scrutiny of legislation, but no one's really mentioned policy. Now, in Tynwald, Legco members get a vote on policy. So what do you see the role of Legco is in policy making and in the scrutiny of policy making?
We'll turn to Mr. Wright first on this one, please.
I think that is a lot of what LegCo has to do, scrutinise policy. Yes, we would have a vote of it, but then you, so I understand that you and the Keys would have the majority vote anyway. I think it's very interesting the fact that we scrutinise policies, we might not agree with them, but then sometimes that would be down to the vote taken on the policy at the time.
Thank you. Mr. Beckett.
The scrutiny element in LegCo is to scrutinise legislation to make sure that inadvertently the policy of the House of Keys hasn't been in some way undermined or misrepresented in the way that things are drafted. Again, those of you who heard my talk a while back know where I'm coming from on this. LegCo doesn't have a political mandate. It's elected by you. It's not elected by the people. You have the political mandate to determine the policies which come forward in the governing of the Isle of Man. You have done that with the programme for government. The role of LegCo, as I see it, is to enable what you have chosen, what you have decided are the main policy issues, to be achieved and not inadvertently undermined.
Yes, it is the House of Keys' responsibility to come up with policy. Having said that, if I just take one example that I do have a particular interest in, which is young people in care. You know, one of the national indicators for success is that we improve, I think an objective, an outcome is to improve the lives of children and families at risk. And one of the national indicators in the programme for government is that in terms of the numbers of young people on care plans or in care, we remain below the UK threshold, the benchmark. Now, on present numbers, I would be surprised if we ever got to a point where we exceeded the UK benchmark. I suppose what I would say is, when you look at the outcome, which is to improve the lives of young people at risk, what else can be done from a policy perspective to deliver that? And I would think, from a Legislative Council perspective, looking at things like what else is being done across government, whether it's through trying to improve education outcomes, trying to improve health outcomes. I think these are areas where the Legislative Council, in looking at one objective, might also be able to say, well, have you thought about this? Not to dictate policy by any means, but certainly to offer input in, to shape future thinking, because at the end of the day, I think what the House of Keys is trying to do is achieve certain positive outcomes for the people of the Isle of Man, and I think the Legislative Council can help with that. Rather, it's a complementary rather than a conflicting role, I think.
Thank you. Next question is Mrs. Caine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the candidates, given that Mr. Beckett's already indicated party membership, but I'd like to ask all the candidates where they would see themselves on the spectrum of the sort of political left to right, and particularly where they'd stand on the current social policy issues that may be coming up in this administration, such as decriminalisation of cannabis and reform of the abortion laws on the island.
This one falls to Mr. Beckett to start with.
Would you like, sorry, just to clarify, would you like a response specifically on those two issues you've mentioned?
Those two issues, and also generally, where are you from right to left? Based loosely on the UK parliamentary system for political parties.
Well, it kind of does what it says on the tin, Liberal Vannin. So, middle of the spectrum, I would say, and open-minded. On cannabis, you'll find my answers possibly inconsistent. On cannabis, we can't legalise, it's part of a criminal network, it's part of the money laundering network. If we decriminalise, we're simply facilitating all the stuff that goes on behind some kid in the bogs having a fag. It's not just that, the implications of the drugs trade are so horrendous that we can't facilitate that by making it legal. It's not the decriminalisation of the user, it's what goes on behind. Now, on the other question, you'll say I'm inconsistent. The question of abortion, I'm a Catholic. My personal views on abortion are Catholic. However, you do not criminalise a woman for having an abortion. You do not set up an entire subculture of illegal abortions as a matter of religious principle. If abortion is to be discouraged, it is a question of conscience, it is a question of one-to-one, it is a question for the woman to determine. So on the question of abortion, I would not oppose the reform of the law that this has been put forward. On the question of cannabis, because I'm not looking this time at the kid, I say kid, who's smoking the damn stuff. I'm looking at the huge industry behind it, which we would inadvertently be promoting. Different perspectives, different ones.
Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
I'd probably describe myself as in the centre, which is a nice sort of fluffy way of describing it, isn't it? But I'm pro a strong economy and I'm pro business, not business getting away with all sorts of things, well-regulated business. So I'm pro that. I'm also socially liberal. On the two specific issues that you've raised, abortion, I do feel we should reform our laws in the Isle of Man. So I would be supportive of that. Cannabis is interesting because it's not something that I had applied my mind enormously to. I did go to the Positive Action Group meeting on it a couple of Mondays, and I found it provided really interesting food for thought. I think what that did was it raised a lot more questions that would still need to be discussed, because I can see that the aim, the fight on drugs, is not working terribly well for us, not just this society, but all over the world. So I can see that there is a drive to try and do something about that. I think how you do it and how you avoid, how you regulate it, if you were to legalise cannabis, it throws up so many issues of pricing, of the supply, the control, and how you then manage a potential black market still. Listening to people at the Positive Action Group talking about the price of drugs that you can buy for £1 or £1.50 cheaper than alcohol. So I think that I'm very open-minded on the issue of where we go with decriminalising or legalising drugs. I think there are a lot of questions to be discussed and thought through before we make any change, but I am open-minded to the idea that we may make some changes.
Mr. Wright.
Where am I on the party spectrum? Central, I would say. Yes.
You're all very good politicians.
Yes. Okay.
You all get the tick box.
Where do I stand on decriminalisation of cannabis? I'm firmly against it. It's no surprise there, considering my former career. Having dealt with it at the sharp end, I've seen the misery, even on the island, that drug abuse or use can bring. As Mr. Beckett's already pointed out, behind every user there's a supplier, a bigger supplier, and of course there's producers that's making a massive amount of money. This in turn funds more illegal activities, terrorism. It's a global problem. I don't think by us legalising cannabis that we do anything useful to our society on the Isle of Man. That said, I personally believe that everything on this world was put here for a purpose. We have, for instance, as a good doctor will know, unless he's already gone, we have heroin, which for another word is pharmaceutical grade morphine, which is used in hospitals to kill pain. It's the same with cannabis. Cannabis is being medically grown and it's being used across in trials to see if it can ease ME and MS. I'm not against that sort of drug use, for want of a better word, where it's controlled by government. So in that regard, no, I'm not in favour of legalising drugs in any shape or form. Abortion, personally, I think we should change the laws on abortion. I'm not a woman. I have no intention of telling any woman how or what to do with her own body, whether she wants the child or whether she doesn't want the child. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you. And the next question, Mr. Harmer.
Thank you. It just builds on the previous questions, because it just builds on that really in the sense of policy, because do you see the role primary as scrutiny, and in the sense of the national programme for government, are you all generally in favour of that? But is there anything else that drives you or is a passion for you? I think you mentioned one of those, but if you were successful for a further 4 years, is there something that you'd like to see different, something changed?
Okay, starting this time with Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
I'm very mindful that Tynwald has approved the programme for government. And I think coming in for a short period to fill a vacancy now, it is not down to any of us to try and change that programme for government or influence it away from where it is going. In terms of the future, I think it's acknowledged by everyone that the programme for government is a living document, in as much as it gives the direction of travel and it gives certain actions that are hoped to achieve. I think it's acknowledged that if there are sort of roadblocks, or if the intended action doesn't deliver the desired result, or other issues come up, then there would be scope to change. I do believe it is for the House of Keys to determine policy and to determine that direction of travel and the actions. As I said before, I think members of the Legislative Council can have a very constructive input into that to make sure that what we're doing is going to be effective and work well. And therefore I would want to be active in inputting into the thoughts that what are the things that we need to achieve going forward.
Mr. Wright.
Moving on, after the first term, I would hope to continue to support the Keys. As we've already discussed, the programme for change for government is a living document, and obviously you have to be able to review it at some stage through it. So roadblocks turn up, you either move around them or you take them out of the way. So basically in the first 9 months till February, I would say I would be getting used to what the policies are, bring myself up to speed, and also seeing where the Keys are moving with the other legislation.
Mr. Beckett.
Yeah, if I was to pick two policies, because had I been contributing to the programme for government, I'd have wanted to mention these. One is in mediation. Where I'm coming from is a lot of poor people, a lot of people who fall between two stools. They can't afford the justice system and they don't qualify for legal aid. Legal aid would be a separate issue, we can't debate it now. So, mediation, and grow that idea into a parallel arbitration system, because that way it's quick, it's simple, it's efficient, it's open, so that would be one thing. The second, which isn't in the programme for government at all, is, and this is something which is a disincentive sometimes, not always to businesses, moving to the Isle of Man and to individuals, is that our insolvency legislation is Victorian. It's the Bankruptcy Act in Code of 1892. If you're made bankrupt in the Isle of Man, you stay bankrupt in the Isle of Man until you have paid 19 shillings and sixpence in the pound, 95p, or whatever that is, 97.5p. Unless the court lets you off. That's a disincentive. It's not a clean break and start again. It's very punitive. The same thing applies with our companies, which of course our bankruptcy legislation applies to all our companies. There isn't a separate insolvency regime. We don't have the equivalent of administrative receivership. You know, take a company to A&E, it might get better. Here it's either trading or it's insolvent, it's in liquidation. That's a big risk for people coming to the island who come from a different culture. And for the last 20 odd years I've been suggesting, and a lot of other advocates have been suggesting, that we upgrade that legislation. Now, programme for government is evolutionary. Part of it is the growth of the economy, bringing people in. If I've identified a disincentive, and I think it's an awful disincentive, the insolvency legislation, then perhaps that could be added to the programme as it grows over the next 3 or 4 years.
Thank you very much. The next question is Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just interested, sorry I did miss the start in your introduction, so you might have mentioned this, but you've all talked about transparency and good governance. How would you deal with the conflict if it did come along your way. How would you deal with that? You've mentioned various organisations that you're connected to or schools. How would you deal with it?
Starting first with Mr. Wright.
I'd recuse myself from the situation.
Mr. Beckett.
It's part and parcel of the work we do as lawyers, and I've sat as tribunal chairman for many, many years over here. You simply recuse. You know when there's a conflict of interest. You declare the conflict of interest and you step out of the situation altogether. If that conflict of interest is one which has the potential to continue to conflict with your role in LegCo, then you remove the conflict of interest.
Mrs. Poole-Wilson?
Yes, I think that's right. If there is a conflict of interest, you have to declare it, and then you have to remove yourself from the situation. I think in my position, I'm mindful that if I stay in a position as parent governor and a trustee of St Christopher's, that would then probably suggest that in order to scrutinise policy affecting those institutions, it's a double-edged sword, because you have the input and the knowledge and the view, but you also shouldn't be scrutinising organisations that you're part of. So the clear thing there, and this is why I say I would like to stay, but if I was elected and it proved impossible, then that would have to be resolved. And the only way you can resolve it is either to step down from the roles that are causing you the conflict, or to find another role, another scrutiny position, which keeps you away from that particular issue. But you cannot, for the sake of good governance and for the sake of people's faith in our parliamentary system, you cannot be in a conflict, or I think be seen to be in a conflict. And I think it does pose real challenges for us in such a small jurisdiction, but I think we have to manage them.
Thank you. Next question, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a large section of the general public out there that view LegCo as a home for retired politicians or the old boys club. What would you do to dispel this image?
So starting this time with Mr. Beckett.
Join it.
Okay, Mr. Poole-Wilson.
I think that my answer would have to be the same. I think my gender would make a difference to the old boys club. I won't go into age. I think that's unfair.
Go.
I mean, one of the things that I'm sure I could say for all three of us is that we probably don't have a huge amount of political experience, and I'm not going to, for a minute, suggest that there isn't an advantage to having had some political experience to sit in the Legislative Council. But I think there does have to be a break. I think this process we're going through is all part of showing the public that we're about transparency, that people who go forward to the Legislative Council, there's a very good basis for why they're there. The particular experience and skills they have are highly relevant. I think the other thing to dispel that notion of people sort of, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a fair notion, but it is, I think, a perception we have to deal with. I think the other thing is to try to show to the public more what the Legislative Council is doing. I don't have a particularly brilliant idea about how we do that, but I think the more we can show these are the important things that the Legislative Council are doing, the more we can help to restore that confidence that it is a worthwhile institution of Parliament and it is doing good work to help with good governance.
And Mr. Wright.
I'd just like to echo what James said. I don't think it will be an old boys club anymore. I think the process that we're going through at the moment shows that. None of us have been none of the three of us standing today, very limited political experience. I wonder whether it would be different if we were towards the end of a term within the Keys, coming up to maybe 4 or 5 years, like, with no disrespect to some of the members that are currently there that have been elevated from the Keys. I think the way that we're going forward, the fact that you select us, or we come to you and we get nominated by you, not being members of the Keys, is the way forward. How do we change the perspective? Through the media, obviously, through education in schools. And I think modernisation is one of the other ways forward that the Legislative Council, although it is rooted in history, we have to modernise it as well. And I think this is a major step forward that you took when the standing orders were amended to allow the action to take place.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question, Chief Minister, Mr. Quayle.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming. You've all clearly stated you're fans of Lisvane. I have to say I'm not a fan of all of Lisvane. I think there are some of his points are eminently sensible, but equally I think there are some points he's got totally wrong, and I think from comments from some of the new members who've come in with a viewpoint, they're maybe changing their mind as they've experienced working in government. So my question to each of you, and I'll let the Chairman decide who takes it first, is which part of Lisvane do you not agree with? Or you can be only one vote, so if you feel you agree with all of it, that's fine by me. But which part of Lisvane would you not implement?
Okay. Well, I'm working on a strict rotation basis, and this one falls to Mrs. Poole-Wilson to answer first.
Well, I think it's very hard to just say there is a part you shouldn't implement, because I think so much of it is bound up with if this, then that, for example. So I think if we're clear that the role of the Legislative Council is to have a revising legislation and a scrutiny function, then I think it follows on from that it does make sense that members of the Legislative Council are not directly elected by the public, and that the process we're going through now is the right way in. We talked before about whether we need a committee for every bill. I haven't drilled down into that level of detail, but query whether that is necessary, for example. Just trying to think what else there is. I think a lot of it does. I'm also mindful that I'm reading it and looking at it from the perspective of not ever having lived either role, whether as a member of the Legislative Council or had political experience in government departments. So I am very conscious that there may be practical issues, for example, saying that no members of the Legislative Council, or indeed there should only be one, in each department there should only be one minister and one member of the Keys. What I've heard from members is that that may not be practical, particularly for big departments, that actually you do need 3 or 4 members for a large department. I still would feel it's important that members of the Legislative Council are not necessarily in department roles because of the importance of transparency and scrutiny. But I'm not sure that that idea that you need only one departmental member as well as a minister is practicable or workable day to day for you in government. And that's where I would be interested to hear from you about the realities of how government can work well.
Right.
Thank you, Chief Minister. If there's one thing I might disagree with, it would be not being a departmental member. My feedback from colleagues in friends in Legco and friends in the Keys is that, as Jane Poole-Wilson has already said, there's a massive amount of work for a minister and a member from the Keys to do. Mrs. Beecroft's massive department, Health and Social Care, Mr. Skelly in Department of Economic Development. These are very large departments which have a lot to go on for, with no disrespect to people to have the political will to run those departments. I personally think that in the right setting and in the right place, a Legco member would be of great assistance to the Minister for those departments.
Mr. Beckett.
Well, Lord Lisvane himself says at the start of his report that it's a discussion document. But they're his views drawn on hundreds and hundreds of pages at the back of the report of interviews that he's conducted. As far as I'm concerned, the jury is out. Until the Keys has debated this in July, until the officers and the government departments have given their input to these conclusions, no one has commented on these conclusions yet. They are just the conclusions. Until it has taken place, we can't say what is good or bad, what we disagree with and what we agree with. The evidence isn't there yet, but it will be when you debate in July.
Yeah, thank you. I might also start taking notes because it's Mr. Thomas again. Mr. Thomas.
Second question, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's in two parts.
Third and fourth, I think. Yes.
Is 8 the right number for indirectly elected MLCs? And if so, why? If not, why not? And secondly, there are various ways that members of the second chamber can be remunerated. And do each of the candidates have any views about whether or not this is the right way and whether there are alternatives that they would consider?
Okay, starting this time with Mr. Wright. Number and remuneration of MLCs.
Number. I think 8's the right number. If I recall correctly, the Speaker has a casting vote. Sorry, not the Speaker, the President has a casting vote. Remuneration. It's always a tricky one. If you look to Parliament across the water, every time the MPs vote themselves a pay rise, the social outfall on media is pretty vitriolic. I wouldn't know what you would do with that. I think that should be set by perhaps a committee, the remuneration for members of LegCo.
Okay. Mr. Beckett.
Again, the number 8 and the very constitution of LegCo is something that you will be debating in July when you look at the various comments that Lord Lisbane has made. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. What's wrong with 8? In terms of remuneration, all members of Tynwald are remunerated on the same basis. I can't see the problem. Basic salary, and then uplifts if they choose to be a member of a particular department. That seems a very fair system for additional. Now, the level of remuneration is a financial matter. As we all know, LegCo won't deal with financial matter.
Okay, thank you. And Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
I think it's difficult to say 8 is the right number. I think once the Lisbane recommendations have been debated and there is more clarity about what will happen going forward, particularly around this debate about the separation of powers, who will be in the executive, how many people are we going to have in each department, and who will be on the scrutiny, or how Tynwald wants to constitute its scrutiny committees, and what numbers you need to do that, that will shine a light on the numbers. I wouldn't suggest more or less in an abstract without that discussion. On remuneration, obviously it has to be something that's dealt with not by us, but I do think there is a really clear distinction between members of the House of Keys and the Legislative Council. Legislative Council are not directly elected and do not have the constituency workload of Keys members, and I do feel it is important that that is in some way recognised in the remuneration structures for members of Tynwald. So again, I think it's about confidence of the public that they understand what members of Tynwald are being remunerated for, and that makes sense and looks fair and a good use of taxpayers' money.
Thank you. Next question is in the hands of Mr. Boot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm Howard Wright. Building on what my colleague, our colleague, Mr. Cregeen said about what will Legislative Council members do if they aren't on scrutiny committees and they seem adamant that they don't want to serve on departments for 9 months. I just wanted to revert back to the departmental issue. This thing is obviously not adopted. It's not a foregone conclusion. It is a discussion document, and I think members' views have changed over the last few months. And we're looking at one man's report telling us what to do with our parliamentary system, which I find slightly obtuse. But going back to the departmental service, I can understand your view on this because you don't have a stated policy on that or a stand on that. But the other two followed and said that they wouldn't be prepared to serve in departments. And my experience as a minister is it's very useful to have people from LegCo within the department.
Building to a...
I am.
You're building to a question, aren't you, Mr.
So I thought I'd have it to say. So the question is really, why have the other two members, potential LegCo members, decided at this point, with no Lisbane debate, that they won't serve in department.
Okay. In the interest of equality, all three are going to have the opportunity to answer, and as it happens, of course, Mr. Beckett to answer first.
The question is, why have the other two members decided not to serve in the department? I haven't decided. What I would say is, just going back to what we said earlier, the three of us, I mean, it's sincerely meant. At the moment, there appears to be an anomalous situation, unusual situation, where the scrutiny committees are full at the moment, and therefore, potentially for 9 months, there would be a certain level of underemployment. You find the other things we've said that we would be doing would fill that time. Nobody is going to be doing this part-time. I think any of the three of us have said remotely that we would not fill our time fully and do everything that was required of us. So, but as I say, in strict terms, you know, as an advocate, the question was, why have they decided this?
Mr. Poole-Wilson.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Lord Lisbane has not been adopted, and we don't know what will come through. So I find myself in a difficult position where you're asked the question, would you serve in a department? Well, if the recommendations that are adopted down the line are that there should be a clear distinction between who serves in departments and who sits on scrutiny, and it shouldn't be members of the Legislative Council, I would be perfectly happy with that. I can see the rationale from a good governance and transparency for why you would adopt that. I can also see the practical reality, and I've heard that from people, that one, there is benefit in people sitting on the Legislative Council who are involved in taking through legislation, actually having a more hands-on practical insight into how government works day to day. The one thing I would say is, so I'm saying I wouldn't serve in a department to be true to my answer that I can see exactly why Lord Lisbane has recommended keeping that distinction between scrutiny and the executive. That's why I've said that. I am perfectly alive to the fact that we're in a state of flux, and that it would be completely wrong for someone to be elected now to the Legislative Council and sit around for the next 9 months, depending on how long it takes. So, to be true to myself, I am pro separation of powers as far as we can achieve it in our small jurisdiction. Practically, I'm not going to sit and not do work that needs to be done, even if that did involve being involved in somewhere in a department. But my preference would be that if you're involved in scrutiny, you don't have that day-to-day involvement in a department. I do think there has to be a mechanism to help people, particularly if they haven't had previous government or political experience. There has to be a way of making sure that people really do understand the issues in departments. Otherwise, you're sitting in a slight vacuum, which I don't think serves us very well either.
And Mr. Wright.
Up until you debate Lisbane and we see what the outcome of that is, I'd be happy to sit on the department. The reason being, until you know what the brief is, you cannot then go back and perhaps introduce into LegCo legislation. And I don't think, or yes, you might be biased towards your department when you're reviewing that, but then you're not reviewing it just for your department, you are reviewing it for Tynwald as a whole. So, to be quite honest with you, yes, you could be a departmental member, you would have your brief whichever department you're in, and you bring that knowledge to your colleagues on the Legislative Council. In the end, the keys are the policy makers. You are the lawmakers, whatever input that you get from us.
Thank you. And Mr. Hooper.
This is just picking up on what you just said there. Right at the start, you said, I won't sit on a department. Now you've just said you will. But really it's a bit more deep than that, because I need to explain it to all three of you. It actually just turns on the second point that you just said, which was that the keys are the policy makers. In actual fact, every member of Tynwald gets a vote on policy. And so it comes back to that question really, that if there is a separation of powers between LegCo and Keys for whatever level, how do each of you envisage being able to fulfil that separation of powers, fulfil that role of scrutiny, if you do end up in a department?
Okay. Good to start with Mrs. Poole-Wilson on this occasion.
Well, this is the problem. This is the difficulty with being in a department and trying to effect scrutiny. I think probably the model that works at the moment would have to apply again, which is that if you're in a department, you're almost obliged to stick with that department's view, but scrutinise other departments. I think that's probably the only realistic way a departmental member can operate, is to advance the department's policy or legislation or whatever it may be, but exercise the scrutiny role in relation to other departments. And I think until we are clear on how scrutiny committees will be set up, if they are going to be changed as an output of Lord Lisvane, I find it very difficult to explain how that's going to happen. That's why I say we're in a state of flux, where it is very difficult at this point to say, well, I would definitely do that. If Lisvane gets to, if what comes out of the debates in Lisvane is that there is a clearer situation where people who are exercising scrutiny should not be in departments, then I would be very happy with that. I think if that's not what comes out of it, then I think we do have to make sure there is clear delineation between someone when they're carrying out a department role and how they are going to be able to carry out the scrutiny role. But I think it's already a problem for members of the House of Keys if they're, from that perspective, if they're sitting in departments.
Thank you. Mr. Wright?
I think it's a very difficult one. Scrutiny and being a departmental member, I wouldn't know how to separate it at this present time, so I couldn't really give you an answer. I could throw the ball back in your court and say we could find out when you've debated Lisvane and what the outcome of that is.
Mr. Beckett?
Well, just to repeat, I wouldn't serve in a department. I would give all my time and effort and energy to the Legislative Council. As a member of Ledgco, as a member of Tynwald, and the overarching Tynwald, I think we've had an example this afternoon. I would like to see changes in encouraging arbitration as well as mediation. I'd like to see changes in the insolvency legislation. Those are policy matters, and I think it would be legitimate to bring those forward. So I think we've mentioned Lisvane. I mean, how many times over the last 30 years have we had external experts reporting on the way we do things? And I mean no disrespect to Lord Lisvane when I say he didn't carry the damn thing down a mountain on 2 tablets of stone. The Keys has yet to debate it. The Keys rules in this matter. And all of it may not go. So I think all I can say on the question of departmental membership, for the reasons I gave right at the start, I will not be a member of the government department. I am not being lazy. I'm not doing a part-time job. I will do everything that is asked of me. And hopefully when this little blockage on the scrutiny committees is by, it's just an unusual period you're in at the moment, that will be one of the main things to do as well.
Thank you. Next question, Mrs. Beecroft.
Yes, thank you. I think some of it's been partially answered, but I'd like a bit more clarity and depth here. How do you believe that we place enough value on the scrutiny function? And if you don't, you've got the Lord Lisvane recommendation. If you don't think that that's the right way to go, how would you strengthen that function? Because there has to be another alternative if you believe the scrutiny function is not given enough value.
Okay, on this occasion we'll start with Mr. Wright.
I'm sorry, I have no knowledge of the scrutiny function, apart from, obviously, legislative. So, until Lisvane is in, I don't really know how I could answer the question.
Mr. Beckett?
Scrutiny in 2 senses. Scrutiny in the technical sense of making sure that the legislation which has been introduced in the Keys is in a form that will give the wishes of the Keys reality, and that would be one aspect of the job. Scrutiny in the sense of policy scrutiny with the policy committee, again a Tynwald function, an overarching Tynwald function that members of the Legislative Council would take part in, very important. Scrutiny in the sense of public accountability, which is perhaps where the members of the public, we are only members of the public sitting in front of you, that we think is very important. That has to be transparent, it has to be as open as possible. I don't understand why it's not transparent and open as possible. In Public Accounts Committee sits in public. So you've got three types of scrutiny: technical legislation, policy, and accountability. All three must be given equal weight.
I would agree with what Mr. Beckett has said. I think without ever having sat and looked at the day-to-day calendars of all members of Tynwald, the sense that I've picked up just from talking to people is that there isn't always the time available for scrutiny committees to sit and do their work. And I think, we've talked about Lord Lisbane a lot this afternoon, and all of that is to be debated. But if what flows in due course is more clarity around the differing responsibilities of different members of Tynwald, it might help. So if you have Keys members perhaps with less of a scrutiny role on, I'm not saying they're not on committees, but if you have members of the Legislative Council who are not necessarily conducting department roles, but whose full remit is running those committees and making them happen, I think that's possibly one way in which we could actually give more weight to scrutiny in practice, and also, I think, demonstrate to the public that it is a serious function that is being taken seriously and delivered. So that would be my one thought, but I recognise at this point that is quite a difficult thing just to achieve, so perhaps it's an evolving way in which we can emphasise the scrutiny element more.
Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the public can be pretty cynical and scathing about politicians, and particularly Legco. I am just interested in your views how you feel you cover that reputational issue if a result of the Lisbane debate is that members of Legco can sit in departments, but you choose not to, and you're then not able to be on a scrutiny committee. The public will say, well, is that a good use of taxpayers' money? How would you tackle that?
Okay, and this one, we'll start with Mr. Beckett.
You explain it to them. But we're getting lost in this idea that people, whichever one of us has chosen, can't sit on a scrutiny committee because the places are full at the moment. That's not always going to be the case. If a member of the public said, this bloke, Beckett, isn't in a department, he's only doing a half-time job, you bring them in for discussion, you talk, you grant them the respectability of debate, you listen to the position that they've got. That's just dialogue. It's not going to last forever. If this anomalous situation, it'll have gone by February. Perhaps whomever you choose from the three of us will also be gone by February. But that situation will have gone. You simply say to people, no, this is unusual. It's simply unusual. We are doing a full-time job, and just explain more fully what the role of Legco is.
Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
Well, I think if we got to that situation, it would be after a Tynwald vote. So at that point, their directly elected representatives would have voted in favour of having a situation where members of the Legislative Council served in government departments. And I think that would be the first point, is that this is a decision by Tynwald that this is what suits the Isle of Man. I also think that then you would have to explain that the way Tynwald has decided to go is the way the Keys have been operating, or do operate at the moment, in that people do have departmental responsibilities, but take an active role in scrutinising other departments. And it may be imperfect, but Tynwald may have voted that way. So I think that would be the practical reality that you would have to explain, and that members of the public would then hold their their elected representatives to account on.
Mr. Wright.
I go along with what Paul said, without necessarily getting them in for a one-to-one discussion. I think it's a lot of it is down to how the Keys communicates through the media to the electorate as to why these changes have taken place, how they're going to impact on how we and how LegCo is going to work in the future. So basically it's a communication issue. You always get, as a member of the Keys, you always get people who, whatever you tell them, you can tell them what they want to hear, but they still won't like what you're telling them. And you always get that in politics.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If in the June Tynwald the Keys votes for a specific recommendation in Lord Lisvane, but LegCo doesn't vote for it, and there's a combined vote in July, how would you vote?
Okay, starting with Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
Good question.
It is a good question. Well, we don't know which recommendation it would be. I think if it was something that I felt was important as a point of principle about how our Parliament should operate, I think I would want to vote on that point of principle in the same way, knowing that the way we are structured at the moment, the House of Keys vote has primacy anyway, which is quite right. So the elected representatives, if there is a problem, the House of Keys is going to win out, which is as it should be. But I think there is an element of being true to yourself, and if you have voted in a particular way because you feel particularly strongly that that's the right thing to do, I'm not sure at that point you should change your vote, unless there's an evidential basis for doing so, a good reason for doing so.
Mr. Wright.
It's a very big if. I would hope to vote with my conscience and with my principles.
Beckett.
I think as Lord Lisvane said, oh, that man's name, over and over. Tynwald is not a, when the two houses sit as Tynwald, you still have the separate character of the Legislative Council and the Keys. If the Legislative Council has within itself debated and reached a conclusion on a particular issue, I don't see that a member of the Legislative Council, in the absence, as we've said, of new evidence coming to light, has the option but to vote in the way in which the Legislative Council itself has determined.
Thank you. Mrs. Beecroft.
Yeah, thank you. So following on from that, I'm not actually sure what the members are saying, because on the one hand you're saying that Keys has primacy and should be there's a ruling body, if you like, and yet you're saying that you would actually vote against the will of Keys if a combined vote was taken the following month, once you knew how Keys was saying this is what we want to do. Also, Legislative Council discusses legislation. It doesn't have a joint position on policy. And if it was a policy issue, and if it was in Tynwald, which you know it is, apart from the secondary legislation, then how could you combine both of those things of saying that Keys has primacy, but on the other hand we'll vote against Keys? I'm not quite sure how that would work with anybody. I'd just like a bit more clarity from the panel on that particular point.
Okay, start this one with Mr. Wright.
It's an interesting question. So I take it that you would normally vote with the Keys.
Would you?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
I just say, would you vote with the Keys in those circumstances, or would you vote possibly as you had originally voted, which may be against Keys?
Well, I would, but in the end, I would vote for the good of the government.
I'm sorry, towards the Parliament, not
Sorry.
the government.
Sorry. Sorry, I just don't understand the question.
May I, Mr. Speaker, just clarify?
You can, go in time.
you. I think Mr. Thomas is saying that where an issue is debated in Parliament, in Tynwald, and the two houses, the Keys vote in favour and Legislative Council vote against, we have the option of bringing it back the following month for a combined vote.
Right.
Now, when you first cast your vote, when you vote against the will of Keys, you don't know what the will of Keys is because you vote all at the same time.
Okay.
But the following month, you would have the opportunity to see what Keys have said. You would know what the position was. So would you still vote against Keys if you had done so the first time? Or would you recognise the primacy of Keys? The fact that we're the elected body and vote with Keys rather than against us?
Okay. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Does that make it clearer?
Yes, it does. I will still vote with LegCo.
Okay, Mr. Beckett.
The two-stage process. The first time round, you've got LegCo and the Keys presenting the vote to the manner in which they have debated. They have now voted yea and nay, and you go to a combined sitting. The will of the Keys must prevail.
Thank you. The question, I think, from Mr. Thomas to begin with was specifically about Liz Vane.
It's a general principle, isn't it?
Right. Well, I think on the general principle, I think once you know the will of the Keys, I think that is a different matter. I think on Liz Vane, given that what is being debated and discussed there about probably the role of the Legislative Council and so on, I think that's a slightly different area where it might be legitimate there to say, well, actually, going back to this idea of departments and so on, if it was felt important, I think, that you wanted to vote in favour of scrutiny, and that wasn't the will of the Keys, I think that's probably one example where I think you might stay true, but I think on other policy matters, to vote against the directly elected representatives when it is clear what the will of the Keys is and why, I think I would be more reluctant to vote. I would have to have an extremely good reason to resist the will of the Keys.
Okay. I'm now going to turn to closing statements again, 3 minutes each, and again I'll start with Mr. Beckett, please.
Well, I think hopefully each of us, I can't speak for my colleagues, has given you the opportunity to see how our minds work, the sort of background we've got. Just the points I think that I made when I opened. It's a full-time post. It's a post to which I would give my utmost. It's not an add-on. I know we've had this suggestion, both say for Alan, who has stepped down from employment. No, this is the job. This is the full-time job, and we would hope to fulfil our duties to the very, very best of our abilities, whichever one of us you choose. And I think that has come out. I can't really sum up more than that. All we can give you is our best, and that is what we will give you, all of us.
Thank you. Mr. Poole-Wilson.
Yes, I think obviously we've spent a reasonable amount of time this afternoon talking about Lord Liz Vane and the potential for change that comes through that. I think the other thing that's important, though, is day-to-day government and the how best to implement what Tynwald wants to see implemented through the programme for government. So I would endorse what Paul Beckett has said about, I'm sure everybody here would absolutely give of their best, their full-time commitment and hard work. I think I have skills and experience that I would like to bring into Legislative Council to try and make sure there are effective outcomes for our island and its people. And I'm thinking there more broadly about trying to achieve the things that government has set out in the programme for government.
Mr. Wright.
First of all, thank you all for coming today. I hope I've been able to give you some insight into my abilities and also into my personality as well. I believe I'll make a positive contribution to the island if I were lucky enough to be elected to be the member for the Legislative Council. I've answered your questions as well as I am able to under the circumstances. Unfortunately, not having a list of questions to prepare for, but that's life. Give me a good experience for dealing with the media. I'm in no doubt that being a member of the Legislative Council is a full-time job, and it was reason enough to resign my post in the civil service to stand for election. That apart, I'm fully committed to working for the best future for the island. This island has made me what I am today, and I would hope to continue to repay it through working with you all. Finally, I'll be available in the Millennium Suite for a drop-in session next Tuesday between midday. I know you're not that hard working. Between midday and 1 PM, assuming the keys is reasonable. Thank you all once again for your time today.
Thank you. Just to say thank you. You've beat me to it. I was going to, thank you, honourable members, for your participation. Thank you to the candidates for coming in and facing the wrath of members of the House of Peers today. Election day is, of course, Thursday the 18th, and if we can thank the candidates.